Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today we have Elizabeth Hinton, the great historian from Yale University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, David. I'm so excited to be here.
So we're going to be talking today about the Vanguard Carceral Journalism Guild, and you have signed on as an advisor. What does this look like, and why is it so important to amplify the voices of the incarcerated?
So the Vanguard Carceral Journalism Guild is something that is completely one of a kind in that it's amplifying original on-the-ground reporting by people who reside in confinement. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about it is that it has, it's not just targeting people on the outside, but it's also seeking to inform and ground conversations and movements, ideas that are happening on the inside. Because there are intentional barriers erected between people who reside in the carceral state and those of us who live outside of it, it's really hard to get a sense of what is going on. I think most people who aren't connected to people who are incarcerated have no idea the kinds of conditions that are maintained, have no idea the kinds of violence that structures the entire system in every iota and every form, have no idea the kinds of human rights abuses that are happening and the politics that are happening, as well as, the amazing initiatives, the self-activity that's going on inside prisons. So, I think in this moment, having reporting from inside is incredibly important. And then having that reporting in a place that, that lives, that can be documented is crucially important, in part because, the public is systematically prevented from having access to any kind of files, archives, from prison administrators themselves. So, if we want to understand what's going on, and then in future generations, I'm a historian, if we want to think about how we then tell the history of mass incarceration, this reporting is really key. I mean, for historians, the kind of like base of any question and project is reporting, is newspapers. And so this is, in a sense, creating the groundwork through which we can have a better sense of what exactly is going on. And, Vanguard is really at the cutting edge of that.
Yeah, and I feel like it's really important, and it's become part of my passion, is to really amplify the voices of people incarcerated, because we were talking about this before we started airing this. But, for most people, it's kind of a black box, a prison system. They don't have any contact with somebody that's incarcerated. They don't see them necessarily even as quote unquote human,
Right.
which I kind of hate to say that, but for most people, it's like, hey, these criminals, they deserve to be locked away and keep them away from us.
Right, exactly. And so, to use another historical analogy, I think if we look at the abolitionist movement for inspiration, it really took getting the voices of enslaved people out there in the public, having, firsthand accounts of the experience and conditions of enslavement by the people who were in the belly of that beast, were truly critical to raising awareness about what was going on when, those conditions and the everyday brutality of the slave system was intentionally kept from the American public. And that helped to build allyships and build a movement that eventually, took down slavery in the US. So, it is crucially important to get the voices of people who are inside out, and also to use their knowledge and expertise as a way to inform, how we then respond to the issue. There's a lot of power in proximity, as people say, and it's not as if those on the outside can tackle any of these issues without leadership and amplification of the problem by those on the inside. And I think the other thing is that, once people actually, there's a lot, in the broader American public, there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of undue stigmatization of people who are on the inside. And that's, of course, on purpose. That is a device to justify the systematic locking up of millions of people in the US that's been going on for decades. And, that really is about locking up Black and brown children, teenagers, and putting them in faraway prisons for most of their adult lives. That's what mass incarceration is really about. And the rhetoric around and the justification from this, from the myth of super predators to, very common ideas that have really kind of defined the American political and public imagination since emancipation, linking Blackness and brownness to criminality, if you're not informed, you just assume, well, the prison population is so large because, these people, quote unquote, are so dangerous. And then when we begin to understand the history of the system, the intentional design of the system, and the fact that, most of the people who are incarcerated are also victims of violence themselves, it begins to disrupt and dismantle the logics that have sustained and grounded the disturbing growth of the US prison population in recent years. So when you actually hear firsthand testimonials, when you get to know people who are just as impacted, then, as you say, David, it kind of breaks down the dehumanizing forces that have attempted to justify this violent system in American popular and political culture.
And just by way of introduction, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You authored what I consider to be a very important book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. Maybe you can talk about how that relates to this topic.
Oh, well, I mean, everything I do, I think, I was a child of the 80s. So I grew up during the war on drugs when a lot of these horrible policies were unfolding. I saw my family, go in and out of the prison system and, fall to drug addiction. But even as a young kid, I knew that there was, a larger story here. As we've been talking about, I knew and would get into a lot of arguments with people that, I knew the process through which my cousins ended up going to prison. And I knew that it wasn't as simple as, well, they're bad people and dangerous and need to be removed. And so I was always conscious of the system. And I think that profoundly shaped the things that I wanted to fight for as an adult. I really don't like injustice, any form of injustice. I don't know. That's just the thing that activates me. And when I started visiting incarcerated family members and loved ones and really saw, the landscape of this mass incarceration firsthand, this was in the early 2000s, I was like, okay, I have to understand how this happened. How did we get here? This didn't just come out of nowhere. This is a historical process. And I was in graduate school. I decided to focus my dissertation research on this question. And I looked to the White House central files of every presidential administration from Kennedy to Reagan to figure this out. And what those files revealed was that indeed, this was a system that was intentionally designed by policymakers at the highest level of government to target young, initially in the 1960s, Black men between the ages of 15 and 24, who were seen as like solely responsible for crime in the nation. And so my first book kind of traces that process of criminalization and ties it to policy. It shows how, federal policymakers decided to disinvest from social welfare programs, disinvest from job programs, welfare, educational opportunities for people, and replace it with policing and surveillance and incarceration. And that was a process that happened, and the seeds of it were planted at the height of the civil rights revolution and progressive social change in this country. And then my second book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s, examines how residents in communities that were targeted with expanded policing and the militarization of policing beginning in the mid 1960s initially responded. And that was, of course, to fight back. That was, of course, to use political violence against police who were abusing them. And this political violence, of course, was tied to the unfulfilled promises of the civil rights movement. The fact that people were still massively unemployed or underemployed, the fact that urban public schools were completely falling apart, the fact that people were living in public housing projects with roaches and rats, and the fact that slum landlords were allowed to extract and exploit low-income people completely unchecked. So this structural violence beginning in the 1960s, and it still continued to bubble through the 20th century, LA in 92, and of course the George Floyd protests of 2020, is tied to those larger systematic inequalities.
So let's go back to the current project. How do you envision this working?
Which part of it working?
There's several parts. So let's start with the Knowledge Carceral Studies Archive.
Okay, so I am the founding co-director of the Institute on Policing, Incarceration, and Public Safety at Harvard University with my dear friend and colleague, the political philosopher Brandon M. Terry. And that we've been in existence since 2020. We are a rigorous research initiative. We do model data science work and really trying to deepen the kinds of questions that are asked about the criminal legal system, but privileging different kinds of research and finding new sources of data because, of course, related to our prior conversation, it's very, very difficult to get good data on exactly what's going on inside, and especially the racial composition of populations that are ensnared within the carceral state. So that's part of it. The other part is, again, under that principle of power and proximity, is partnering with and amplifying the voices and the very important work that's being done by justice impacted people. So, I think the most promising social movements in the US today are organizations, initiatives that are created and entirely led by justice impacted people. And so we try to amplify that work. So one, really exciting example is this, we worked with the Center for Justice Impacted Students at Middlesex College in New Jersey on their youth reform project. And we counseled and supported and helped to train young people who were researching juvenile waivers. So New Jersey has a really high rate of young people getting waived up to adult sentences. And so in an attempt to kind of attack that larger problem, our first step was to work with the students who wanted to do this project to research the kind of history of this initiative and various policy alternatives to try to get the parole board to allow young people to be paroled within the juvenile system rather than the adult system where there's a lot more resources. So we helped them put their presentation together. We brought in the great justice impacted abolitionist lawyer, Angel Sanchez, to help us with the training and help with this presentation to the parole board. So we're really interested in basically using the resources of universities that are implicated in this problem themselves to help support and amplify the work that is being done by those closest to the problem. So the opportunity to support the Vanguard Carceral Journalism Guild and many of the other initiatives that we're trying to plan is, in part about supporting the work, but also documenting that work. Again, having an archive and having these voices amplified, having them made, available not only to the public, but also to other incarcerated people to get new conversations going, is vitally, vitally important. When we know that, prison administrators systematically destroy records, law enforcement systematically destroys records, it's up to us to create that record. And, if we don't have the voices of those, the experience of those, the experiences of those who do reside in conditions of confinement amplified and available and retained and archived, then we're never going to be able to understand the system. We're never going to be able to think about how then change and transformation can be generated.
And then you've already staged a Harvard versus MCI Norfolk debate at Norfolk. What was that about, and why is it so important to debate inside prisons?
Yeah. So that was in part of a larger initiative that when I was a professor at Harvard, I was involved in. I should just say, I think that it is vitally important. In fact, it is our moral obligation, those of us who research the carceral state, to also then not only amplify the voices of people who have experienced the carceral state firsthand in our work and support their own self-activity and movement building, but then to also call on our universities to support the expansion of educational opportunities for people who are incarcerated. So I tried for many years to get Harvard to start a college and prison program, to no avail. That could be the subject of another podcast. And in fact, it's part of the reason why, it's not the reason, but it's part of the reason why I left Harvard for Yale. Yale has a very robust prison education program in which I now teach, and I have been teaching in for the past 2 years when classes opened up after the pandemic. And so we, as a part of trying to break that barrier, we set up this debate between Harvard and Norfolk. Of course, the Norfolk Debate Society is an extremely important society historically. I think it might, I can't say this for 100% certainty, but I think that it might be the first prison debate society in the country. It is, of course, one of the alums of that society was the great Malcolm Little, who became Malcolm X, and within that debate society, Malcolm really owned his skills as a critical thinker and as a public speaker, and owned his style of argumentation, and basically, established the important roadblocks that helped make him go on to become one of the most important figures in world history. And so that is part of the reason why these debate societies within prison are so important. But we staged this debate between Harvard and Norfolk. Unfortunately, I was cheering for Norfolk, probably not surprisingly. Norfolk lost. They debated the utility of the Electoral College, but Norfolk had, at least in the mid 20th century, a really, really strong record. I think they had 144 debates in total. These debates were with student groups from the outside, and they only lost 8 times. So that's a pretty amazing record. That's like 136-8. So you can't really get better than that. So that was a really, I think, exciting experience, and one that I'm hoping at Norfolk and other institutions that we can kind of reinvigorate but remix, so that, through the Carceral Forensic Society that we've conceived, and this is, the kind of brainchild of the great ghostwriter Mike. And instead of emphasizing this kind of like outside-in approach to debate, creating debate societies so that people who reside in the carceral state can debate one another. And I think, the idea of a national collegiate debate society in prisons across the United States, where incarcerated people are having conversations with one another, is really exciting. I mean, for me, I think that's one of the touchstones of Vanguard's work, and as I see it, like, our role in supporting Vanguard is that, again, the intended audience is not white liberals on the outside, but formerly incarcerated people, building community within those groups, and then by extension, building community engagement.
And also tell us about the Carceral Forensic Society.
Yeah, so that's part of the MCI Norfolk debate, and my role in that, and the debating teams that already exist in Valley State Prison, and other prisons across California, kind of evolved into this idea of thinking about how we could expand these programs within, perhaps initially within California, within various prisons and prison debate teams in California, but then also having, prison debate teams in Valley State debate Norfolk, or having, my students at McDougall Walker in Connecticut debate Donovan in California. So, I think the whole purpose of the system is to keep people as isolated and divided as possible. And these societies really help to break, the forensic society can really help to break those barriers. And also, having debate teams, and the idea within the Carceral Forensic Society is that there would be kind of like a three-tiered weight class according to one's level of education. So associate students would compete against other associate students, bachelor students, and then master's students, is a new way to engage people in the material that they're reading in their classes in school. And it encourages people to do outside work, outside research, really owning their writing skills. I think like one way to think about it is, instead of having, rap battles in the yard, we can have like debate battles across prisons in the classroom. So that's kind of the way that we envision what the Carceral Forensic Society could be.
And, getting back to probably our original point here, is that as these activities increase, as these programs increase, then you're giving skills to people that have been trapped on the inside for, in some cases, a long time. And then once they get released, I mean, one of the amazing things that I learned in the last year or so is that people that go to school while incarcerated, they get their GED, they get their bachelor's degree, their recidivism rate drops to almost nothing. We're not doing people any favors just locking them in a cage.
Exactly. And, I think so there's that, there's the recidivism piece of it. But I also, for me as an educator, I also view education as a human right. So I think, education to people who are, going to be really expanding educational opportunities to people who are going to be released in 5 years or in 100 years is equally important, because, we live in, at least in theory, we'll see for how long, a democracy. And part of how you have a vibrant democracy is having vibrant educational access and opportunities. When you receive an education, you come to understand yourself and society much better. You become more engaged in your community. And, that's really important. And like I said, like, should be something that is guaranteed to us, to all of us as human beings. I think the other, I'll let you ask.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think the other aspect of this that's really important is kind of this concept of two-way education, that it's not just educating people on the inside, it's also educating people on the outside.
Right.
And you talked about breaking down these barriers, and these barriers are really high.
Yeah.
And I mean, we ran this piece a couple weeks ago, and I was just reading the comments on it, and they're abysmal. And it's this guy who, he's been serving LWOP for, since he was like 17 or 18 years old. So he's a kid, right? And the judgment people are raining down on this guy who's talking about all the things that he's been able to do and what he's experienced is just mind-boggling. And we need to be able to tell these stories in a way that people can receive them.
Right, exactly. People can receive them, people can understand what's going on, and then people can get activated. I mean, I see it with my students in the outside at Yale. When I include the testimonials of people who have experienced the system firsthand, when they're able to interact with justice impacted people, when I bring in guest lectures, that begins to change their entire mindset. And I think most people have absolutely no idea what is actually going on in the prisons that they pay for. And, that should be an open conversation. Again, I think the abolitionist movement is a really great analogy. People living outside of the southern states didn't really know, because of the propaganda that the southern planters were saying about slavery. We treat our slaves well, this is what they want, they're happy, all of that. But then when enslaved people started saying, no, this is not it, started talking about how families were getting ripped apart and separated, started talking about the brutal punishments that people face, the sexual violence that was an everyday occurrence within the slave system, that's when people got activated. And now, again, those testimonials have created an archive that historians still rely on to help understand the experience of enslavement. And I think, especially in a moment when, this is precisely why these histories are under attack right now. Under the kind of banner of critical race theory, there are a lot of people in this country who want to erase and deny this history, which is why it's even more important that we marshal documentation, because the powers that be don't really, don't want these stories to be told. So in that sense, just telling one story and then bearing witness to that story is an important form of resistance and also movement building.
So we're just about out of time and we need to wrap up here. So give me a couple thoughts, going forward, what people might want to think about, what your goals are for this program.
Yeah, so I think, one of the kind of things that are underlying the programming initiatives that we're partnering with Vanguard on are, ways to address the very real literacy problem in prisons across this country, and thinking about how, we can transform book apathy that might exist among residents of the carceral state to book curiosity. So, in addition to the Forensic Society, which I think helps students, engage even more deeply and actually exercise the skills that they're learning in their college classroom, we have devised what we're calling the Re-Up audiobook project, which basically makes accessible scholarly texts that may seem kind of opaque or inaccessible, and empowers people who are in prison to take those books and remix them in partnership with authors, reinterpreting some of the arguments, relaying those arguments in ways that people can understand them, setting them to musical soundscapes, creating poetry, and recording this through audio, so that these ideas, these arguments, these histories are accessible to people, even if they aren't at a reading level where they can be able to process and engage with those ideas. And the hope is, right, once you begin to spark new curiosity, once you get people excited about books, when books might seem to be scary or boring or all those things, once those ideas can be related to people's individual lives, that helps spark intellectual curiosity, a love of learning, and a deeper engagement with one's own history and the forces around us. I'm a historian because I believe that you cannot understand anything about the present unless you understand the past. And once you understand the past, grapple with the conditions in your present, then you can think about how to build a more equitable, more humane future. So, it's about helping to build community, helping to foster and sustain community engagement, and then helping people to tap into their own curiosities and desires to learn on their own terms, expanding literacy in the process. And we know, in the conversation about recidivism, right, expanding literacy also helps to improve recidivism and sets people up to succeed when they return home.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for coming on. And I'm really looking forward to this partnership and seeing where we can go. We at the Vanguard are always looking to amplify the voices of the marginalized. And unfortunately, people that are incarcerated are among the most marginalized in society.
the most marginalized and the most undereducated. So we're here to change that.
Thanks again.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.